Every history you have ever been told about Westeros begins in the middle of the story. The conquest, the Andals, the long night, the age of heroes. Even the oldest tales the Maesters record, Bran the Builder raising the wall, the Grey King slaying the Sea Dragon, Lan the Clever laughing his way into Casterly Rock. Even those are late arrivals. Before all of it, there was a world with no kings, no castles, no knights, no septs, no writing. A continent covered nearly shore to shore in forests so old and so dense that a squirrel was said to be able to travel from the Cape of Wrath to Casterly Rock without ever touching the ground. In that forest, something lived, something that was not human. This is the Dawn Age, the first and longest chapter in the history of the known world, and the one we understand least. Thousands of years, 2 intelligent species, a war that reshaped the map itself, and almost no reliable record of any of it. So how much of the Dawn Age is history, and how much is myth we have simply been repeating for 12,000 years?
Let us begin the way a maester would begin, with a definition and then with an apology for it. In the scholarship of the 7 kingdoms, most completely set down in the great chronicle compiled by Maester Yandel for the Iron Throne, the history of the known world is divided into broad epochs. The Dawn Age is the first of them. Its definition is deceptively simple. The Dawn Age is the age before the coming of the first men to Westeros, and before the pact that ended the war between men and the children of the forest. By the reckoning of the Citadel, the first men crossed into Westeros roughly 12,000 years before Aegon's conquest. Their war with the children lasted some 2,000 years. It ended in a treaty. That treaty opened the Age of Heroes. Everything before that treaty is the Dawn Age. Notice what that definition actually does. It defines the age not by what it was, but by what it was not yet. The Dawn Age is a negative space in the historical record, a period named after the sunrise that ended it, and there is a reason for that. The Dawn Age has no historians. Consider the problem plainly. The children of the forest kept no books. They had no letters at all in the sense men understand. Their knowledge lived in song, in memory, and, we will return to this, in trees.
The first men had runes. They carved them on stone and on standing markers, but those runes recorded names, claims, and boundaries. They were not chronicles. No first man sat down to write a history of his people, because no first man could have conceived of doing so. Writing came to Westeros with the Andals, thousands of years later, and the Andals arrived as conquerors and as zealots. They burned the weirwoods. They put the children to the sword wherever they found them. The first people in Westeros capable of writing history were the very people with the strongest reason to erase the history that came before. So every word we have about the Dawn Age reaches us through a chain of transmission that would make any honest scholar wince. An event happens. It is remembered in a song sung by a people who leave no writing. That song is heard by men who also cannot write. Those men pass it down orally for thousands of years. Then a foreign culture arrives, conquers, converts, and finally, thousands of years after that, writes it all down in a language the original singers never spoke, filtered through a religion that considers the original gods to be demons. That is the evidentiary situation. It is not merely poor, it is close to the worst imaginable.
And this is why the Maesters themselves are divided, not just about what happened in the Dawn Age, but about when, and even about whether. The traditional dating, 12,000 years, comes down from the songs and the boasts of the great houses, but there are those in the Citadel who consider it nonsense. Certain Maesters, the skeptical tradition, whose most famous voices question nearly every ancient claim, argue that the true figure is closer to 6,000 years, and that the deep antiquity of the first men is an artifact of miscounting. Their reasoning is practical. In a world where record-keeping is oral, generations get doubled. Dynasties get stretched, and every noble house has an incentive to make its line older than its neighbours. Consider the absurdity the traditional count produces. House Stark is said to have ruled the North for 8,000 years. 8,000 years of unbroken male line succession would require hundreds of generations, and not one of them failing. Compare that to the historical record we can actually verify. In the 3 centuries since the conquest, we have watched dynasties fracture, fail, and be replaced repeatedly. The skeptics have a point. The believers have a counter-argument, that magic, longer memory, and the Weirwood network preserved things that ordinary human institutions could not.
We will not resolve that debate today. No one can. But we must carry it with us, because it colours everything that follows. So here is the honest framing of our subject. The Dawn Age is not a period we can date. It is not a period we can narrate year by year. It is a period we must reconstruct, from songs, from ruins, from the shape of the coastline, from the biology of surviving species, and from the testimony of a handful of beings who were actually there. Because, and this is the strangest fact in all of Westerosi history, the Dawn Age is not entirely dead. There are still witnesses. Strip away everything men built, and look at what was there. Westeros in the Dawn Age was overwhelmingly forest. Not woodland with clearings, but continuous old-growth canopy running from the far north to the southern coasts. The Wolfswood, the Haunted Forest, the Kingswood, the Rainwood, the Great Forest of the Riverlands. These are not separate woods. They are fragments, leftovers, the scattered survivors of a single enormous forest that once covered nearly the whole continent. The tale that a squirrel could cross the continent without touching the ground is a folk saying, not a survey. But folk sayings of that kind usually preserve a real memory of scale, and the physical evidence supports it. Everywhere men later settled in Westeros, they settled by clearing. The fields of the Reach, the plains of the Riverlands, the farmland of the north, these are not natural grasslands. They are wounds in a forest, kept open by axes for thousands of years. Here is where the Dawn Age becomes genuinely alien. The map itself was not the map we know. 2 enormous geographic features of the modern world did not exist in their present form during the Dawn Age. First, the Arm of Dorne. Where today there is a broken scatter of islands and reefs between Westeros and Essos, the stepstones, the broken arm, there was once a land bridge, a continuous isthmus joining the 2 continents. Think about what that means. In the Dawn Age, Westeros was not an island continent. It was a peninsula of the world. Anything that could walk could reach it. Second, the neck. That thin, drowned, fever-ridden band of bog and black water that divides the north from the south was not always a swamp. Before the flooding, it was solid ground, and it was the highway of the continent. Both of these transformations, according to tradition, were not natural. Both were acts of war. We will come to that. Then there is the matter of the seasons. In the known world, seasons do not follow a fixed year. Summers may run a decade. Winters may run a generation. No maester has ever satisfactorily explained why, and George R.R. Martin has been explicit that the true answer is not a mundane one. The irregular seasons of this world are magical in origin, and any in-world natural explanation is a guess by people who do not know. We do not know whether the seasons were already broken in the Dawn Age, or whether they became broken later. This is one of the great open questions, and it matters enormously, because a world with predictable seasons can develop agriculture easily, and a world without them cannot. What we can say is that the Dawn Age was a world with far more ice than the present. The far north held mammoths, and still does beyond the wall. It held giants. It held direwolves in numbers that later dwindled to legend. That is the fauna of a cold, forested, sparsely peopled world. And through all of this, no records. Not damaged records, not scattered records. None. The children of the forest had no writing. The first men carved runes, but wrote no histories. Whatever the peoples of the Far East were doing, and there we have hints of something older and stranger, none of it reached Westeros. So how does a historian work in a period with no documents? The same way an archaeologist does. You read the things people could not lie about. 1. The land itself. Broken land bridges and drowned isthmuses are physical facts. Whatever caused them, they happened. 2. The ruins. Stone survives songs. Ring forts, barrows, the foundations of the oldest castles, and certain structures of black fused stone that nobody can explain. 3. The living remnants. Weirwoods with carved faces still standing. Giants still walking beyond the wall within living memory. Children of the forest still alive in the deep caves. These are not artifacts. They are survivors. 4. The pattern of the legends. Not the content of the myths, the distribution. When people separated by an ocean, worshipping different gods, speaking unrelated tongues, all preserve a story of the same event, that convergence is evidence. Not proof. Evidence. Hold on to that fourth method. It will become the most important tool we have. Now, let us meet the people whose age this was.
We call them the children of the forest. They never called themselves that. In their own tongue, the true tongue, the language of song, they named themselves those who sing the song of earth, the singers. That single fact should reorder how we think about them, because children is a name given by outsiders, based on the crudest possible observation. They were small. Men saw beings the size of children and named them accordingly. It is the oldest error in the study of another people, to define them by how they compare to yourself. We are not guessing about their appearance. Living singers have been seen and described in our own time, in the caves beneath a great weirwood beyond the wall, by a boy named Brandon Stark. They stood roughly the height of a human child, though they were fully grown adults. Their skin was dusky brown, dappled like a deer's hide, and it darkened with age. Their eyes were large, enormous, golden or green, slit-pupiled like a cat's. Eyes built for a life beneath a heavy canopy and in caves where light is scarce. Their ears were large. Their limbs were slender. And their hands? This detail matters. Their hands had 4 fingers, tipped with sharp black claws. They had no beards. Their hair was often wound with leaves or with vines and flowers. They dressed in leaves, in bark, in woven grasses, and they were long-lived. One singer, called Leaf in the common tongue, stated plainly that she had lived more than 200 years. 2 centuries of life per individual has a profound consequence for how we should read Dawn Age history. In a society where a person may live 10 human lifetimes, oral memory is not a game of whispers passed through 50 mouths. It may pass through 5. A singer alive at the signing of a treaty could plausibly still be alive to correct the story 200 years later. That is a fundamentally different and far more reliable mode of remembering than anything human societies had. It is also perhaps why the singers never felt any need for writing. Now, the harder question. Where did the singers come from? We do not know. This is not a case of conflicting theories. It is a case of no theory at all. The maesters of the Citadel say the children were in Westeros when the first men arrived. That is the beginning and the end of the record. There is no migration legend for the singers, no origin myth recorded by men, no ancestral homeland pointed to in any surviving tale. But there is one tantalizing thread, and it lies across the narrow sea. In the great forest of Qohor, deep in eastern Essos, the wandering Dothraki found something they did not build and did not understand. Carved trees and abandoned stonework and the traces of a vanished forest people. The Dothraki called them the Ifaquevron, the woodwalkers, or those who walk in the woods. Carved trees, in a forest, made by a small vanished people who left no cities. The parallel is difficult to dismiss. If the woodwalkers of Cahor were the same kind of being as the singers of Westeros, then the children were never a Westerosi species at all. They were a world species, a forest people who once existed across both continents and who were destroyed almost everywhere by the spread of humankind. And if that is true, then the war we are about to describe was not a local Westerosi tragedy. It was the last act of something that had already happened elsewhere. What kind of society did they have? The tales are consistent and, for once, specific. The children had no kings and no queens, no lords, no armies in the sense men understand, no cities. They lived in the deep woods, in caverns, in crannogs on the lakes, and in secret tree towns hidden in the canopy. They worked no metal. Their blades were obsidian, dragon glass, napped to an edge sharper than any steel. Their bows were weirwood. They hunted with flying snares and with slings, and with those black blades, and they were said to be able to bring down a stag in flight of a thrown stone. Now, a modern historian is tempted to read that list, no metal, no cities, no writing, no kings, and file the singers under primitive. That would be a serious analytical error, and here is why. A society is only primitive relative to the problems it needs to solve. The singers did not build walls because they did not need walls. They could not be found. They did not forge steel because obsidian and magic served. They did not write because they had trees that remembered and lives long enough to carry the memory themselves. They developed instead along an axis that men could barely perceive, let alone match. And when men finally forced them to fight, the singers did not answer with bigger armies. They answered by moving the sea.
We must now speak of the trees, because the weirwoods are not scenery in this story. They may be the single most important thing the Dawn Age produced. Weirwoods have chalk-white bark, dark red five-pointed leaves, and sap the color of blood. They grow slowly, live enormously long, and are extraordinarily difficult to kill. Their stumps do not rot, and their roots persist for millennia. Into their trunks the children carved faces with deep-cut eyes that weep red sap. The singers carved those faces so that their gods could see. That is the stated purpose, preserved in the oldest tradition of the North. A tree with a face is a tree the gods look out of. To the men who later inherited this religion, that was a metaphor for divine witness. Vows sworn before a heart tree cannot be broken in secret because the gods are watching. But it may not have been a metaphor at all, because we now know something the septons of the faith never accepted and the masters of the citadel largely dismissed. Through the weirwoods, a greenseer can actually see. Past and present, distant places, events centuries gone. Which means that the weirwood network was not a religion built around a symbol. It was infrastructure. Consider what a continent-wide network of linked trees would give a people with no writing and no roads, distributed memory, long-range observation, and a permanent archive that could not be burned, stolen, or misremembered, only cut down. And that is precisely what men did to it. The first men cut weirwoods as they cleared land. The Andals, thousands of years later, cut them deliberately, systematically, and for religious reasons, hacking down the heart trees of the south wherever they conquered. On a lonely hill in the Riverlands called High Heart, 31 weirwood stumps still stand in a circle. The Andals cut that grove down. Nothing has grown there since. The local folks say the hill is haunted by the ghosts of the children who died defending it, and no one will disturb the ground. If we are right that the weirwoods were an archive, then High Heart is not a haunted hill. It is a burned library.
At the apex of the Singers' Society stood the Greenseers. A Greenseer was one who could see through the eyes of the weirwoods. In the tales of men, the Greenseers were the great wise ones and sorcerers of the children. And in one telling, it was said that each of them wore 1,000 eyes, because they saw through every tree with a face. They were rare.
The rarity has been quantified for us in the only place such a thing could be, by a teacher instructing a student in the craft. Roughly 1 person in 1,000 is born a skin changer, able to enter the mind of a beast, and roughly 1 skin changer in 1,000 is born a greenseer, 1 in 1,000,000. For a people who may never have numbered more than a few tens of thousands across an entire continent, that ratio is devastating. It means the greenseers were never many. It means the loss of even a handful was a civilizational catastrophe. And it means that the power of the children that men so feared was concentrated in a vanishingly small number of individuals who could be hunted. It may be that the singers did not lose their war because they were outnumbered in battle. It may be that they lost because a species with 1 greenseer per 1,000,000 souls cannot replace them faster than an enemy can kill them.
And their religion? The gods of the children of the forest, the gods men later called the old gods, are nameless. They are the innumerable gods of the streams, the forests, and the stones. There is no scripture, no clergy, no temples, no commandments, no promised afterlife that any text records. The worship consists of presence, standing before a heart tree, keeping silence, listening. This is one of the most unusual religious structures in the known world, and its strangeness is instructive. Nearly every other faith we can study, the faith of the Seven, R'hllor, the drowned god, the many-faced god, has doctrine, hierarchy, and a professional priesthood. The old gods have none. Why? Possibly because a religion built around greenseers does not need priests to interpret the divine. If the gods are literally looking out of the trees, and if certain individuals can literally look back, then theology is unnecessary. You do not need a doctrine of the divine presence when the divine presence has an address. The singers, then, were a small, long-lived, deeply rooted people, without metal, without cities, without kings, and with an intimate command of forces that men would spend the next 12,000 years failing to understand. But they were not alone in that forest. Of all the wonders of the Dawn Age, the giants are the one where the evidence is cleanest, and the fate the cruelest. Giants existed. They were not a legend, not a folk memory, not a misremembered tall tribe. Within the events of the novels, giants are seen, spoken with, fought beside, and killed. They came south with the free folk. They walked through the wall. And here is the important part for the historian. They were nothing like the giants of Southron nursery tales. Southron stories describe giants as enormous men the size of a house, who live in castles, who grind bones to make bread. The reality, as reported by those who lived beside them, was different. Real giants were huge and broad and shaggy, hairy from head to foot, with faces more brutish and flatter than a man's, closer to a bear's than to a man's. They were nearer 12 feet than the 20 of legend. They wore no clothing, only their own thick hair, though some wrapped themselves in hides. This is a textbook case of what happens to accurate information as it travels away from the people who possess it. The free folk who lived with giants described them correctly. The Southrons, 10,000 years and 2,000 miles removed, turned them into ogres. It should make us cautious. If the Southrons got the giants that wrong while giants were still alive, what have they done to everything else in this documentary?
Giants rode mammoths. They spoke the old tongue, the language of the first men, and had names in it. They had no kings and no lords. They built no homes but caves and the shelter of the great trees. They were, by every account, a people in slow decline long before their end. The free folk who knew them best said plainly that the giants were dying, that they had been dying for a very long time, and that the world had grown too small for them. During the Dawn Age, giants ranged far further south than they did in later ages. Northern tradition holds that the wall itself was raised with the help of giants, and that the great hall of Winterfell and the deepest works of the north bear their mark. stones no team of men could have lifted. Whether or not those specific claims are literally true, they encode a real historical memory that men and giants once shared this continent, and that early human construction in the north involved stonework of a scale later generations could not replicate and struggled to explain. Some maesters have argued that giants are not truly a separate people at all, but a related lineage of humankind, a cousin branch. The evidence does not settle it. What the evidence does settle is that they fought, they spoke, they mourned, and they are almost certainly now gone.
The Dawn Age bestiary was not limited to peoples. Dire wolves, wolves the size of ponies, with a cunning far beyond ordinary beasts, once ranged across all of Westeros. By the present day they are unknown south of the Wall, so rare that their reappearance is treated as an omen. Mammoths still walk the far north, lizard lions haunt the bogs of the Neck, and on the wild island of Skagos the people are said to ride unicorns. Note the pattern in that list. Every one of those creatures survives only in the coldest, wildest, least settled margins of the continent. Beyond the Wall, in the swamps, on an island nobody visits. This is exactly the distribution pattern of a megafauna collapse driven by human expansion. The Dawn Age was not merely a period before men. It was, ecologically speaking, the last period in which Westeros was fully itself.
And then there are the others, the ones we cannot classify. Every people of Westeros has stories of beings that the maesters file under folklore. Grumpkins and snarks invoked to frighten children, merlings beneath the waves, the squishers of the Three Sisters, said to be scaled men who steal women from the shore. A responsible historian would dismiss all of these, except that we now must admit an uncomfortable methodological problem. For thousands of years, the maesters filed the children of the forest under folklore too, and the giants, and green-seeing, and the others. The record of Westerosi scholarship on the question, is this legend real, is genuinely poor. The skeptics have been wrong about the largest questions more often than they have been right. This does not mean the squishers are real. It means we should hold our dismissals more loosely than the Citadel traditionally has.
But there is one category of evidence that is not folklore at all. It is physical. It can be touched. And it is the single most disturbing thing in the archaeology of the Dawn Age. Across the known world, in places that had no contact with one another, there exist structures built of a strange, oily black stone, fused, seamless, and unlike any masonry any living culture can produce. In Old Town, the Great High Tower stands upon Battle Isle, and its lowest foundation is a labyrinthine fortress of that fused black stone, older than the tower, older than the city, older than any record of who raised it. No one knows who built it, no one knows how. Far to the east, on the borders of the Shadowlands, the 5 forts of Yi Ti are made of the same seamless black material, each vast enough to house 10,000 men, and reputedly not built by human hands at all. In the jungles of Sothorios lie the ruins of Yin, a dead city of that same oily black stone, abandoned for so long that the jungle itself refuses to reclaim it. And on the Iron Islands, the Ironborn found a chair of oily black stone carved in the shape of a kraken, sitting on the shore of Old Wick when they arrived. The sea stone chair. They did not make it. They have never known who did. 4 sites, 2 continents plus an island chain. 1 material, no builders. And here we reach the true frontier of Dawn Age history. If those structures are contemporary with one another, and we cannot prove that they are, then there existed at some point a civilization with global reach and a technology or a sorcery that no subsequent culture has matched. Not the singers, who worked no stone on that scale. Not the first men, who built in rough-hewn blocks. Not even Valyria, whose dragonfire-fused stone is the closest analogue we have, and which came tens of thousands of years too late. Some in Old Town have wondered aloud, in guarded language, whether the Black Stone was raised by something not human. The Ironborn have a legend that they are descended from something that came out of the sea, and in the deepest folklore of the Eastern world, there are references to the Deep Ones and to the drowned god-kings of a vanished age. We have no way to test any of it, but it means we must state something plainly, and it is the most important sentence in this section. The children of the forest may not have been the first inhabitants of the world. They may only be the first that anyone remembers.
12,000 years before the conquest, or 6,000 if you side with the skeptics, men came to Westeros. They came from the east, out of Essos, and they crossed on foot, not in ships, on foot, over the Arm of Dorne, that vanished land bridge, a crossing that may have taken generations, in waves, families and clans and tribes, drifting west across an isthmus for centuries. We should resist the image of an invasion. There is no evidence of a fleet, a king, or a campaign. What the evidence suggests is migration, the slow, unplanned spread of a people into empty-seeming land, driven by the ordinary engines of migration everywhere: population pressure, hunger, feud, and the rumour of better country over the hill. The first men almost certainly did not know they were entering someone else's continent. To their eyes, they were entering forest, endless, uninhabited forest. That misunderstanding is the origin of everything that followed.
What did they bring with them? 3 things, and each one was decisive. First, bronze. The first men worked metal. Bronze swords, bronze axes, bronze-studded leather. Against a people whose finest weapon was a napped obsidian blade, bronze offered durability, mass production, and reach. Second, horses. The children had no mounts. The first men rode. Speed, carriage, and the ability to project force across distance belonged entirely to one side. Third, and this is the one that decided the war, fire and the axe. The first men cleared forest. They felled trees for fields, for pasture, for timber, for fuel, for palisades. They burned undergrowth to open land. And crucially, they cut down weirwoods. Understand what that meant to the singers, and the conflict becomes not merely comprehensible, but inevitable. To a first man, cutting a weirwood was clearing a field. To a singer, it was blinding a god and burning an archive. There is no villain in that image. That is what makes it a tragedy rather than a crime story. 2 peoples, each behaving reasonably by their own lights, whose most ordinary daily activity was an atrocity to the other.
The first men were not a nation. They were tribes and clans and petty chiefdoms, held together by kinship and by war, without any central authority. There was no king of the first men. There were hundreds of small kings, and their kingship was the kingship of a strong man over a valley. They spoke the old tongue, a language that survives today only among the free folk beyond the wall and among the giants. Almost nothing of it remains in the south, except in place names and in the names of ancient houses. They wrote in runes on stone. Those runes survive, carved on barrow stones, on the old markers of the north, on ancient blades. And here is a detail that ought to trouble us. Much of that runic writing can no longer be read. The knowledge of how to read the oldest First Man runes has been substantially lost, even at the Citadel. We have their texts. We cannot read them. Their warfare, so far as we can reconstruct it, was raiding warfare. Cattle theft, feud, the burning of rival settlements, the seizure of women and grain. It was chronic and small-scale, and it never stopped, because there was no authority capable of stopping it. That is a crucial detail for the war with the children. A society of hundreds of independent chiefs cannot make peace, because there is nobody who can make peace on behalf of everyone. Even if one chief laid down his axe, his neighbor would keep cutting. This may explain why the war ran for 2,000 years, not because either side had the strength to win, but because the human side lacked the political architecture to stop. And here we come to the most remarkable fact about the first men, and the one that tells us the most about how the Dawn Age truly ended. The first men arrived in Westeros with their own gods. We do not know who those gods were. Not a single name survives. Not one. And then they abandoned them. The first men adopted the gods of the children of the forest, the nameless gods of stream, stone, and tree. They took up the old gods so completely that within a few thousand years, the old gods were considered the native religion of humankind in Westeros, and men were dying to defend them against the Andals. Think about how extraordinary that is. Conquering peoples do not usually adopt the religion of the peoples they defeat. It happens, but when it does, it tells us something specific, that the conquered culture possessed something the conquerors found undeniable. The first men did not merely make peace with the children, they converted. Which raises a question this documentary cannot answer, but must ask. What did the first men see during that war that convinced them the Singer's gods were real?
The war between the first men and the children of the forest was, at root, a war over trees. Men came and men cleared. They took the land the children lived in, and they cut the trees the children worshipped. Trees which were also, as we have argued, the children's memory, their communications, and their eyes. The chronicles state it flatly. The first men felled the weirwoods, including trees with faces carved into them, and the children took this as an act of war and struck back. The killing began.
This was an asymmetric war, and it was asymmetric in both directions. Men had numbers, bronze, horses, and a birth rate the Singers could not begin to match. A human generation is 20 years. A Singer may live 200. That longevity, which made them wise, made them slow to replace their dead. Every Singer killed was a loss measured in centuries. But the children had the forest, and they had magic. The children fought as the forest fights. They struck from cover with obsidian blades and weirwood bows. And, the tales say, they sent beasts against men. Wolves and bears and cats, driven by greenseers who could enter the minds of animals. If skin changing is real, and we have direct evidence within living memory that it is, then this is one detail of the old songs we should probably accept as literal rather than poetic. A greenseer who can wear a direwolf can also send a pack. That is not a fairy tale. That is a documented capability, applied at scale.
And then there is the greatest claim in the entire Dawn Age record, the one that either proves everything or discredits everything. The songs say that the greenseers of the children gathered on the Isle of Faces, and there worked their most terrible sorcery, and that they called down the hammer of the waters. The sea rose, the Arm of Dorne shattered, the land bridge between Westeros and Essos was broken into the scattered islands we call the Stepstones, and the continents were severed forever. The purpose, according to the tales, was simple and desperate, to stop any more men from coming. And here we must be scrupulously careful, because this is exactly the kind of claim where legend and geology can be separated. The event is not in dispute. The Arm of Dorne was once whole and is now broken. That is a physical fact written into the seabed. Something drowned it. The explanation is entirely in dispute. Was it sorcery? Or was it the ordinary work of rising seas and sinking land? A slow geological process that took centuries, and which a people with no written records remembered as a single cataclysm, and attributed to the gods who were being begged to send it.
Both readings are defensible, and note that the skeptical reading does not require the tale to be a lie. If the greenseers prayed for the waters for 100 years, and the waters came, the songs would say the greenseers called them. That is how human memory works everywhere. But there is a complication for the skeptics, because the tales say it happened twice. The breaking of the arm did not stop the war. Men were already in Westeros in numbers, and they kept clearing.
And so, the tales say, the children tried again. This time at the neck, the narrow waist of the continent, where the north meets the south. They struck a second time with the hammer of the waters. And this time, it worked only partly. The neck did not shatter. It drowned, sinking into an endless expanse of bog and swamp and black water, a wilderness of quicksand and lizard lions that has resisted every army sent through it ever since. And here is why this second event is so much harder to dismiss than the first. Consider the strategic effect. The drowning of the neck created a permanent, unbreachable choke point at the exact latitude where the Northern Kingdom would later be born. For 12,000 years, through the Andal invasion, through the Age of Heroes, through the Conquest and after, no Southron army has ever forced the neck against the will of those who hold it. The Andals conquered every kingdom in the south and were stopped cold at the swamps. The North remained the North, and remained faithful to the old gods, and remained first men in blood and custom, because of that swamp.
Whether the children raised the waters or not, the historical consequence is undeniable. A Dawn Age event determined the political and religious geography of Westeros for the entire remainder of its recorded history. And the Crannog men who live in that swamp, the people of the neck, small, dark-haired, said by their neighbors to be strange and to speak with trees and to be skin changers, may themselves be the closest surviving link between men and the children of the forest.
The war ran, by tradition, some 2,000 years. 2,000 years. Longer than the entire recorded history of the Seven Kingdoms, from the Andal invasion to the present day. 100 human generations, born into a war that had no living memory of its beginning and no visible prospect of its end. We should be honest that 2,000 years almost certainly does not mean 2,000 years of continuous warfare. No society could sustain that. What it more likely describes is a condition, a 2-millennium period of chronic, intermittent, generational violence, punctuated by long stretches of uneasy coexistence, local truces, trade, and probably intermarriage of custom, if not of blood. The tales record the human cost in terms that are unusually raw for a maester's chronicle, that the children of the forest died in far greater numbers than men, for men were bigger and stronger, and their weapons of bronze and their horses gave them an advantage the children could never overcome, and that the children were fewer and could not replace their dead. They were losing. Slowly, over 2,000 years, they were being erased. And then, according to every tradition we possess, something happened that almost never happens in the history of the known world. The war stopped.
At the heart of the Riverlands lies a vast lake called the God's Eye. At the center of that lake lies a small island, thick with weirwoods. It is called the Isle of Faces. There, the tales say, the war ended. The chiefs and heroes of the first men met with the wise ones and greenseers of the children, and after long negotiation they made a peace. The first men would take the coastlands, the high plains, the bright meadows, the mountains and the bogs. The children would keep the deep forests. And, this is the clause that mattered most, no more weirwoods would be cut anywhere in the realm. And to seal it, the tales say, every tree on that island was given a face so that the gods themselves could witness the treaty, which is why it is called the Isle of Faces. An order of men was established to keep that island and tend those trees, the Green Men. Almost nothing is known of them. They are said to be there still.
Set the mysticism aside for a moment and read the Pact as what it structurally is, a territorial settlement with an environmental protection clause and a shared religious guarantee. Look at what each side actually got. The children secured the deep woods and, far more importantly, the weirwoods. Every one of them, everywhere, including in human territory. That is not a partition. That is a sacred easement running across the whole continent. The first men secured everything they actually wanted. The open land, the coasts, the plains, the pasture, the land you can farm. This is a remarkably intelligent treaty, and it worked because it correctly identified that the two peoples did not, in the end, want the same thing. Men wanted arable land and pasture. The singers wanted the trees. 2,000 years of slaughter to discover that the conflict had been, all along, negotiable. But it also carried a hidden clause, and the hidden clause was the one that changed the world.
To honor a treaty sworn before the weirwoods, the first men had to accept that the weirwoods was sacred. To protect a god's tree, you must acknowledge the god. And so the pact did not merely end a war, it transferred a religion. Within a few generations, the first men were worshipping the old gods as their own. The gods they had brought from Essos vanished so utterly that not one name survives. The children of the forest lost the war militarily and demographically, but in the longest possible view, their gods conquered the conquerors and are still worshipped in the north today, 12,000 years after the last singer was seen south of the wall.
Now, how much of that should we believe? There are at least 3 defensible readings, and an honest documentary must present all of them. The traditional reading. The pact happened essentially as described, a single negotiated treaty at a specific place with named terms. This is the version the songs preserve and the maesters record. The compression reading. The pact was not an event, but a process, a gradual settling into coexistence over centuries as men and children exhausted themselves and worked out local accommodations valley by valley. Oral tradition, which struggles to remember processes, compressed a slow piece into a single dramatic scene on an island. This is how human memory almost always handles long transitions. The skeptical reading. Some maesters question the deep chronology entirely, and by extension, every detail hung upon it. In this view, the pact is a founding myth, a story told later to explain why men in Westeros worship trees and to give the great houses an ancient legitimacy. This documentary's position is that the compression reading is the strongest, but with a significant caveat in favor of the traditional one.
The caveat is this: the Isle of Faces is real. The God's Eye is real. The weirwoods on that island are real and carved and have been protected for as long as anyone can recall by a body of men whose entire purpose is to keep them. Cultures do not usually invent a sacred site and then maintain it unbroken through 12,000 years and 3 religious upheavals for a treaty that never happened. Something was agreed there. Whatever it was, it held. And the pact opened 4,000 years of peace between men and the children, a span the maesters call the Age of Heroes. The Dawn Age was over. We have spoken of wars and treaties and sorcery, but history is mostly not those things. History is mostly people eating, working, burying their dead, and trying to get through the winter. What follows is reconstruction. There is no ethnography of the Dawn Age. What we have are 3 legitimate lines of inference: the physical remains that survive, the practices of the free folk and the mountain clans who preserved first men custom in near isolation, and the deep traditions of the North which are explicitly inherited from that era. Where we infer, we will say so. First men dwellings were of earth, timber, turf, and stone. In the North, the practice of building long houses with a central hearth and no chimney, smoke finding its way out through a roof hole, persists among the free folk and the mountain clans to this day, and there is no reason to think it was ever different. Their strongholds were ring forts, circular earthen banks topped with timber palisades, sited on high ground. Ring forts of exactly this kind survive across the North and were still being used by the hill clans within recorded history. This is defensive architecture built for raids, not sieges, a design that assumes your enemy is a neighboring clan who will be gone in 3 days. And they raised barrows, great mounds of earth over their dead, with runestones set at the head. The barrowlands of the North are covered in them, hundreds of grave mounds, some vast, in a landscape where the dead outnumber the living many times over. Those barrows are, in a very literal sense, the largest surviving structures of the Dawn Age in Westeros. They are also almost entirely unexcavated. Northmen do not disturb the graves of the first men, which means the single greatest archaeological resource on the continent has never been opened.
They hunted, they herded, and they farmed, in that order of importance most likely in the earliest period. The forest gave deer, elk, boar, hare, and birds. The rivers gave salmon and trout. The coasts gave seal and fish and shellfish. They kept cattle, sheep, goats, and swine, and they had dogs. Agriculture existed, but was hard. In a world where a winter can last 5 years, grain farming is not merely labor, it is a gamble that may not pay for a decade. The northern practice that survives today is instructive. Oats, rye, barley, root crops, turnips, and cabbage, the hardy, storable, unglamorous crops, and above all, preservation. Salting, smoking, drying, and the digging of deep cellars. The entire culture of the North, its grimness, its hoarding, its suspicion of luxury, its obsession with the coming winter, is best understood not as a temperament, but as an adaptation, formed in the Dawn Age and never abandoned because the danger never went away. 3 words survive from that era as a family motto. They are not a boast, they are a survival protocol. Winter is coming. Furs, hides, and coarse wool, leather boots, cloaks pinned with worked bronze, ornament of bronze, bone, amber, and jet, all materials attested in the north and among the free folk. Trade certainly existed, and we can prove it in an unexpected way. Dragonglass is volcanic. It does not occur everywhere. Yet obsidian tools and weapons are found across Westeros, including in regions with no volcanic source at all, and the free folk beyond the wall still find caches of it. Material that travels beyond its geological range is the archaeologist's clearest signature of exchange. Some of that trade may have been between species. The children napped obsidian. Men wanted it. Men had bronze, cloth, and cattle. 2,000 years is a long war, but it is also long enough for a great deal of quiet commerce along its edges. First men custom, as it survives in the north, rests on a small number of absolute obligations. Guest right. Bread and salt taken under a man's roof makes him inviolable. This is the oldest and most fiercely held law in Westeros, and its violation is regarded not as a crime, but as a blasphemy that the gods themselves will punish. The first night. A lord's claimed right to a bride on her wedding night, an ancient custom of the first men, abolished in most of the realm, quietly retained in some corners of the north. The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. The principle that a lord who condemns must execute, and must look the condemned in the face. A justice system with no professional executioners, no gallows, and no distance between judgment and consequence. What these 3 customs have in common is that none of them requires literacy, courts, or a state. They are laws for a world with no institutions, enforced by shame, by kin, and by the belief that the trees are watching. That is a Dawn Age legal system, and remarkably, most of it is still in force in the North today.
On family structure, we know least of all. Kin groups and clans, extended households, likely patrilineal descent given later northern practice, but note that the free folk, the least changed inheritors of first men culture, practice bride stealing and give women far greater latitude in war and leadership than the feudal South. Which of those is the older pattern? We cannot say. We return at the end to the trees, because in the Dawn Age, religion and magic were not 2 subjects, they were one. The old gods have no names, no images, no scripture, no priesthood, and no temples. The place of worship is a godswood, a stand of trees, ideally with a weirwood heart tree, a pool of black water, and silence. The rites are simple and physical. Vows are sworn before the heart tree. Marriages are made there. Prayer is silent. And in the oldest days, the tales say, the tree was fed.
Sacrifices were hung in the branches of weirwoods, and the roots drank blood. Northern tradition acknowledges this openly, that the first men made blood sacrifice before the heart trees, and that this practice was ended long ago, though how long ago and how completely, no one will quite say.
Skin changing, entering and wearing the mind of a beast, is real. It is not a legend. It is observed, described, taught, and practiced within the events of the novels. Roughly 1 person in 1,000 is born with the gift. The bond most often forms with dogs, wolves, cats, birds, or boars. And a skin changer who bonds with a single animal for life is called a warg when that animal is a wolf. And there is a further teaching from those who practice it. When a skin changer's body dies, something of them may pass into their beast and live on in it for a time. A second life. It is not resurrection. It is, the free folk say, a slow forgetting of what it was to be a man. Now apply that to the Dawn Age. If 1 person in 1,000 is a skin changer, then in a population of hundreds of thousands scattered across a forested continent, there were thousands of them. And unlike today, nobody was telling them it was impossible. The Dawn Age was not a world where magic was rare and hidden. It was a world where magic was ordinary, unremarkable, and probably regulated by custom rather than by wonder. And above the skin changers, the green seers. Through a weirwood, a green seer can see the past, not as a record, but as presence. Standing at a heart tree, they can watch events that occurred beneath that tree centuries or millennia before. They can see distant places in the present. And there are indications, guarded and incomplete, that they may glimpse things yet to come. The teaching given to the last known human green seer is precise about the limits. The past cannot be changed, only witnessed. The trees remember, but they do not obey. This transforms our understanding of what the Dawn Age was, historiographically. Every other lost period in the known world is lost absolutely. Old Gis, the great empire of the dawn, the builders of the black stone, those are gone, and no power can retrieve them. The Dawn Age is different. If green seers can see the past through the weirwoods, then the Dawn Age is not destroyed. It is stored. Every event that occurred before a carved tree is, in some sense, still happening, still viewable, still there. The greatest archive in the history of the world exists. Almost nobody can open it. And men have spent 12,000 years cutting it down for firewood and for God.
One last question, and it is the one that hangs over the whole era. Why is the present world so much less magical than the Dawn Age? The Citadel's own explanation is uncomfortable, because it implicates the Citadel. There are those who argue that the Maesters have deliberately worked to drive magic from the world, the Archmaesters of the higher mysteries dismissing sorcery as fraud, the Order steadily replacing wise women and woods witches with rational men in grey. Others hold that magic depends on the things that carried it, the weirwoods, the singers, the dragons. Cut down the trees, kill the children, let the dragons die, and magic does not so much vanish as run out of vessels. Both may be true. Both point the same direction. Magic did not leave the world. The world dismantled the machinery that magic ran on.
The Dawn Age ended 12,000 years ago. Here is how much of it is still standing. The oldest castles of Westeros are Dawn Age or Age of Heroes inheritances, and they are recognizable by their architecture, not the tall, elegant tower and curtain wall castles of the Andals, but low, massive, thick-walled structures that seem to have grown out of the rock. Winterfell, whose walls are said to have been raised by Bran the Builder, whose hot springs run beneath the floors, and whose crypts are older than the castle above them. Storm's End, whose impossible curtain wall is attributed to the same builder and to magic besides. Mort Cailin, of which 20 towers once stood and 3 now remain, a fortress of basalt in the swamp that has stopped every army that ever tried it. The wall itself, 300 miles of ice, raised, tradition says, with the aid of giants and the magic of the children. In every case, the pattern is the same. The structure is real, its age is genuinely great, and the explanation offered is a legendary builder credited with more than any one man could achieve. Bran the Builder is almost certainly not a person. He is a category, the name later ages attached to work they could not otherwise account for.
The great houses of the north, Stark, Umber, Bolton, Karstark, Mormont, Reed, Manderley excepted, trace descent to the first men. So do the mountain clans, the Crannog men, the free folk beyond the wall, and in significant part, the houses of the Vale's mountains, the Iron Islands, the Stormlands, and Dorne. But it is House Stark that carries the Dawn Age most directly. The Kings of Winter, in an unbroken line said to run 8,000 years. Their sigil, a direwolf, an animal of the old forest. Their gods, the old gods. Their seat built around a god's wood older than the castle. Their words, a warning about the seasons. Their justice, a first men right. Their children, in the present day, bonded to direwolves, the skin changer's gift, resurfacing in a family that has held to the old ways longer than anyone else in Westeros. That is not coincidence dressed as symbolism. It is continuity. Of all the powers of Westeros, House Stark is the one that never stopped being a Dawn Age institution. The old gods, the gods of the children of the forest, remain the religion of the north, of the free folk, of the Crannogmen, and of scattered godswoods across the south where old first men families never converted. Every major religious and cultural fault line in Westerosi politics runs along a border drawn in the Dawn Age. North versus south, old gods versus the seven, first men custom versus Andal feudalism and chivalry. The neck as the line between them. When the North declares independence, when Southron lords sneer at northern barbarism, when a Stark distrusts a knight, these are not the politics of the present. They are 12,000-year-old fractures, still load-bearing. There is one more legacy, and we will only touch it, because it belongs to the age that followed. The Pact opened 4,000 years of peace, and at the end of those 4,000 years came the Long Night, a winter a generation long, and out of the cold came the others. Men and children fought that war together. The children gave dragonglass to the Night's Watch, and were still sending obsidian to the wall long afterward. The wall was raised. The Night's Watch was founded. The alliance that saved the world was only possible because of a treaty signed on a lake island at the end of the Dawn Age. Had the Pact failed, had men and children still been killing one another when the cold came, there is a strong argument that there would be no Westeros at all. The Dawn Age did not merely precede history, it made history survivable.
We come now to what we do not know, not as a footnote, as the main event. Because the honest measure of a historian is not what they claim, but what they concede. Who was first? We have assumed the children of the forest were the original inhabitants of Westeros. That assumption rests entirely on the fact that no one remembers anyone earlier. But the fused black stone beneath the high tower is older than Old Town, older than the first men, and no tradition, human or otherwise, claims it. The children worked no stone like that. Someone did. How many were there, ever? We have no population figure for the singers, not an estimate, not an order of magnitude. A species with 200-year lifespans and one green seer per million may never have been numerous, which would mean the War of Two Peoples was a war between a continent of men and a population that might have fitted inside a single modern city. Did the green seers really break the world? The arm is broken. The neck is drowned. Both are facts. The cause is not. And notice the uncomfortable symmetry. If the Hammer of the Waters was real, then the children possessed the power to reshape continents, and still lost. Which raises a darker possibility. Perhaps they did not lose because they lacked power.
Perhaps every use of that power cost them something they could not afford. What was in the songs we stopped singing? The oldest First Men runes can no longer be read. The true tongue of the singers is spoken by no man. Entire libraries of weirwood have been felled. The Citadel has lost, mislaid, or suppressed portions of its own oldest records. This is not passive loss. Much of it was deliberate. Andal axes, Septon fire, Maester skepticism. The Dawn Age is not simply forgotten. It has, at several points in history, been erased on purpose.
Which legends are true? Consider the Citadel's record. Giants, called myth, and they were real. The children, called myth, and they are real. Green-seeing, called superstition, and it is real. The others, called a tale for children, and they are returning. 4 times the skeptics have been wrong about the largest questions of the Dawn Age. It does not follow that every legend is true. It does follow that skepticism, in this particular field, has a losing record, and that the burden of proof may not sit where the maesters have placed it. And the last question, the one that has no answer at all. If the weirwoods remember everything that ever happened before them, and if a greenseer can look through those eyes into the deep past, then somewhere in the roots beneath Westeros, the Dawn Age is not lost. It is waiting. The Dawn Age is the longest chapter in the history of the known world, and the thinnest. We have no chronicles from it, no names we can trust, no dates we can defend. The very numbers we use to measure it may be wrong by half, and yet almost everything that matters about Westeros was decided in it. The shape of the coastline, the location of the borders, the religion of half a continent, the choke point that keeps the North a nation, the gods that men still swear by, the customs that still decide who lives and who dies at a Northern Lord's table, the magic that is now, after 12,000 years of dormancy, beginning to wake. All of it, Dawn Age. All of it still running. There is a temptation, in a period this obscure, to fill the silence, to declare the myths true because they are beautiful, or false because they are convenient. Both are failures of nerve. The better discipline is the harder one, to hold the evidence and the uncertainty at the same time, to say that the Arm of Dorne was broken, and we do not know by what, that the children of the forest were real, and we do not know where they came from, that someone raised the black stone, and we will very likely never learn who. Because the Dawn Age is not fascinating in spite of what we cannot prove, it is fascinating because of it. It is the last part of this world that has not been colonized by certainty, a place where the maps run out, where the records fail, and where the only witnesses left are a handful of pale trees standing in the snow, trees that men carved faces into so that their gods could see, and which have been watching patiently ever since. They have seen everything. They simply have not been asked. The oldest tales are the truest tales, and the truest tales are the oldest.